Just a quick note before we begin, if you're bothered by things such as graphic, violent images, then this video isn't for you. Now let's get into it. Welcome to the basic facts of the restoration of the Ten Commandments cult. Let's start with Kibwetere communicates with the Virgin Mary. Joseph Kibwetere was born in Uganda in 1932, where he would spend his youth attending the local Catholic schools. Kibwetere would excel in the environment enough that he would work as a Catholic school teacher in the 1960s. Meanwhile, a man named Paulo Kashaku in the Kanungu district of Uganda was claiming to see visions of his recently deceased daughter, Evangelista. He would gain a small following of believers that he would tell his deceased daughter was showing him visions of Jesus, the Virgin Mary, and Saint Joseph. Kashaku would encourage his other children, including a young daughter named Credonia Mwerinde, to travel Uganda and spread the word of his visions. But instead, Mwerinde would grow up to be a bootlegger of banana beer, and most people would label her as a prostitute, but those who knew her stated she was promiscuous with an affinity for married men. She would end up with a common-law husband named Eric Mazima, who would later state that Mwerinde was obsessed with money. In 1980, Kibwetere would make friends in politics when he would support a politician in the Democratic Party, but this candidate would lose the election, sending Kibwetere back to his family farm with his wife and his children. Kibwetere would be a supervisor for that region's Catholic schools, as well as bootlegging moonshine on the side. But in 1984, he would suddenly claim he had a vision of the Virgin Mary, telling him to reestablish the Ten Commandments. Kibwetere meets Mwerinde. At this time, a man named Dominic Kataribabo was working at the Katabi Seminary as a counselor. He was considered one of the best the seminary had ever had. Kataribabo was doing so well that in 1985 he was awarded a full scholarship under a program that benefited third world priests to attend the Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, California. 2 years later, Kataribabo earned his master's degree in religious studies and returned to Uganda. At this same time, Mwerinde's bootlegging business went bankrupt, but shortly after, in 1988, Mwerinde would come out with claims that the Virgin Mary was speaking to her and telling her to reestablish the Ten Commandments. These visions of the Virgin Mary would cause her to come in contact with Kataribabo, who would become a supporter of her claims along with a small group of people. The next year, Mwerinde would meet Kibwetere, stating to him that the Virgin Mary had instructed her to bring him into the group. The group is banned by village elders. Kibwetere would end up taking Mwerinde and around 200 followers into his home. Kibwetere's wife would later state that her husband had completely changed when Mwerinde showed up, that Mwerinde was making the rules now, including one where Kibwetere was no longer allowed to sleep in the same room with his wife. Instead, he had to sleep in the room Mwerinde was staying in. Kibwetere would end up selling most of his property, including a pineapple field, a banana plantation, a dairy, and poultry farm, to feed all of the members the group was recruiting. Locals who knew the group stated that Mwerinde was in charge, claiming that all the rules were coming from the Virgin Mary, such as Kibwetere was ordered to stop feeding his family, and that sex was not allowed among members, including married members. In the early 1990s, Kataribabo is able to join the group full-time when he's excommunicated from his church, for not only mishandling church donations, but also for being too interested in Mwerinde and her visions of the Virgin Mary. Any children who were part of the group were forced to sleep away from their parents on the floor of a small shed. One of Kibwetere's daughters stated that she had overheard Mwerinde telling a member that all children under the age of 5 should be killed as a sacrifice. It was also around this time that Mwerinde would claim that the Virgin Mary had told her that the AIDS epidemic in Africa was punishment for people breaking the sixth commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." Members were also told that outsiders were evil and that associating with them was forbidden. Suddenly, Kibwetere would announce to the group that he was told by the Virgin Mary that the world would end on December 31st, 1999, and that they must begin to prepare for the apocalypse. In 1992, village elders held a meeting on behalf of Kibwetere's family and decided to ban the group from the village. Mwerinde's father would end up giving the group a farm to live on in Kanungu. Kibwetere is hospitalized for a mental illness. Soon after moving to Kanungu, Kibwetere would be excommunicated from his church, not only because he stood by Mwerinde, but because it was found out he was using the church as a recruitment tactic. Members who joined now were expected to sell all of their possessions and give the money over to the group leaders. Kibwetere, Mwerinde, and Kataribabo convinced members that possessions were evil because they corrupted people. During this time, there would be points where the entire group wouldn't be allowed to talk. Rather, they would have to speak to one another through hand gestures loosely based on sign language. Members would wake at dawn and pray until noon. Then they would work on the farm until nightfall. But although the group harvested food, members mostly ate beans while the rest was sold to help fund the group. Allegedly, members only ate on Mondays and Fridays while fasting the rest of the week. Members were also expected to pray at the rock where Mwerinde stated she had had her first vision of the Virgin Mary. During the time here, Kibwetere and Mwerinde began to reveal more revelations, allegedly from the Virgin Mary, including one that stated that Japan would flood until it no longer existed. The leaders would publish a book with their revelations called A Timely Message from Heaven, the End of the Present Times. They would send this book out to thousands of people in Uganda while forcing their followers to read it 3 times a week. Around this point, the leaders now own numerous farms, houses, and cars. They opened compounds in at least 9 districts across Uganda with around 5,000 members. But in 1998, Kibwetere was admitted to Batabika Mental Hospital in Kampala, which the doctor attributed to a mental breakdown brought on by bipolar disorder. A church fire. When December 31st rolled around and Kibwetere's prediction of the world ending didn't happen, thousands of members left the group demanding their money back. For the members that stayed, Mwerinde announced that they would build a new church, this time over the grave of her father, who had died years ago. At the beginning of March in 2000, the group was seen by locals buying massive amounts of Coca-Cola and slaughtering their cattle. Members told them they were having a goodbye feast because of another vision the leaders had disclosed to them. But at the same time, Kataribabo was allegedly seen purchasing 40 liters of sulfuric acid, an extremely corrosive substance. On March 15th, some government officials stated they had received letters from Kibwetere, whom they had been friends with, stating that the end was near and this was his goodbye. On March 17th, locals called officials stating that they saw fire coming from the newly built church by the group. When officials arrived, they found 330 members inside who appeared to have burned to death, 78 of which were children. At first, officials believed the fire was a mass suicide until they realized that the doors and windows of the church had been nailed shut from the outside. And a few feet from the church, they found 6 additional bodies in a latrine that had been stabbed and/or strangled. Arrest warrants. A week later, authorities went to another compound owned by the group in Buhunga, between 20 and 30 miles from the burned-out church. Here they found 153 bodies, some of which had been dismembered. Behind the home of Kataribabo in a small sugarcane field, authorities found 74 more bodies, all which showed stab wounds. Inside of Kataribabo's home, underneath a newly poured concrete floor, authorities found 81 bodies, most of which showed signs of strangulation. It's believed some of them were still alive when they were buried. Authorities would search other known compounds owned by the group. They would find 80 more bodies. These showed signs of poisoning and/or skull fractures. Overall, 924 members were found dead. The bodies from the church would be buried in a mass grave nearby, while the bodies at the compounds would be buried in 2 separate mass graves. Authorities would go on to state that they could not confirm nor deny that the leaders were among the dead, since they couldn't afford to conduct DNA tests. But they did reveal that one of the bodies found at the church had a priest's collar, leading them to believe it was Kataribabo. Shortly after, a 17-year-old male came forward claiming he was part of the group and was able to slip away before the fire. He also stated that Kibwetere was not present at the church that day. Locals would also come forward stating they saw Mwerinde leaving the area of the church shortly before the fire was spotted. In April, these claims led to authorities issuing arrest warrants for the leaders of the group. More bodies. The investigation went cold until 2014, when there were reports of Kibwetere being spotted in Malawi, but nothing came of it. Till this day, there hasn't been an official investigation report released. Authorities stated that they couldn't finish the investigation due to lack of funds. Today, the mass grave by the church is so overgrown that even locals can't find it, and all of the compounds have been abandoned. Authorities have stated that they believe the murders took place because when Kibwetere's prediction of the apocalypse didn't happen, members began to demand their money back, and they also believe that there are more bodies of members throughout Uganda that they didn't find. Whether or not you believe that the Virgin Mary communicates with a select few, or that Kataribabo, Kibwetere, and Mwerinde were con artists that found a way to make easy money, you now know the basic facts of the restoration of the Ten Commandments cult. Thanks for watching.